The humidity in Charleston always felt like a heavy woolen blanket, but tonight, inside the oak-paneled sanctuary of my study, the air was ice cold. I sat in my wingback chair, the one that had belonged to my father and his father before him, swirling a glass of neat bourbon. The liquid was the color of a sunset over the battery, but it tasted like ash. I wasn't looking at the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I was looking at the two people sitting across from me on the velvet sofa. My daughter, Cassandra, and her husband, Julian Vance. They didn't look like family. They looked like creditors. "I need the money by noon tomorrow, Dad," Cassandra said. She didn't lead with a "how are you" or a "it's good to see you." She led with a demand, her voice as sharp as the designer stilettos she was currently digging into my Persian rug. She was sliding a document across the coffee table, a num trum, Hong Dola debt notice from a private equity firm I'd never heard of. Julian leaned forward, his silk suit catching the light. He was a man who smelled of expensive cigars and unearned confidence. He didn't look me in the eye. He was too busy admiring the antique silver service on the sideboard. "And don't be late, Arthur," he added, his tone dripping with a faux camaraderie that made my skin crawl. "These people don't do extensions." It would be a shame if the Sterling name ended up in the headlines for something as pedestrian as a default. I looked at Cassandra, my Cassie, the girl I used to carry on my shoulders through the magnolia plantations, the girl I'd sent to the finest finishing schools in Europe. Now, she was looking at me with a cold, calculated hunger. It wasn't just the money she wanted, it was the submission. She wanted to know that even at 65, I was still her personal ATM, a relic of the old world she could bleed dry whenever her husband's investments went south. "500,000, I said softly, my voice rasping. "That's quite a bit of liquidity on 12 hours' notice, Julian." "For a sterling, it's pocket change," Julian replied with a dismissive wave. "Besides, we both know the development project on King Street just cleared its permits. You're flush, Arthur. Don't play the humble patriarch with us." I took a slow sip of the bourbon. I didn't tell them that the King Street project was currently tied up in a secondary audit because of clerical errors Julian himself had likely introduced during his brief, disastrous stint as my junior consultant. I didn't tell them that I knew about the offshore accounts or the gambling markers Julian had accumulated in Savannah. I just looked at the clock and Mouy 10th century French mantelpiece that ticked with the steady rhythm of a heart about to stop. "Family is everything, isn't it?" I asked, my gaze drifting to the portrait of my late wife, Eleanor, hanging above the fireplace. She had died 5 years ago, taking the warmth of this house with her. Cassandra had stayed for the funeral, then asked for her inheritance payout 3 days later. Cassandra sighed, a sound of practiced exasperation. "Daddy, don't start with the family speech. We're in a bind. You have the means. If Mom were here, she'd have already signed the wire transfer." That was the knife. She knew exactly where to twist it. Eleanor had been a saint, a woman who would have given the clothes off her back to a stranger, let alone her only child. Using her memory to extort $500,000 was a new low, even for Cassandra. I felt a strange sensation, then a sudden, crystalline clarity. The grief that had weighed me down for 5 years didn't vanish, but it hardened. It turned into something sharp, something functional. "You're right," I said, setting my glass down with a precise thud on the coaster. I looked Julian square in the face. "Eleanor wouldn't want you to suffer. Tomorrow, you say? By noon?" Julian's eyes gleamed. He nudged Cassandra with his elbow, a silent victory lap. "Noon sharp, Arthur. We'll come by the house to pick up the certified check. It's better that way. No digital trails for the creditors to sniff out prematurely. I'll have it ready," I promised. I even managed a small, tired smile. "I'll leave it in a box on the foyer table. I have some. Early business at the docks. I might not be here to see you off." Cassandra stood up, smoothing her skirt. She walked over and kissed my cheek. It was a cold, dry gesture, the kiss of Judas in a Charleston zip code. "Thanks, Daddy. I knew we could count on you. We'll stay at the beach house tonight and swing by in the morning." "The beach house," I repeated. "Of course. Sleep well, Cassie." I watched them walk out. I watched the taillights of Julian's silver Porsche car I had paid for disappear down the long, oak-lined driveway. I stood there in the silence of the great house, the shadows stretching long across the floorboards. 4 hours later, I wasn't in bed. I was at Charleston International Airport, sitting in the quiet luxury of the private terminal. Beside me was a single Toomey suitcase and a thick leather folder. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Elias Thorne, my attorney and the only man in this city who knew where all the bodies were buried. "The transfers are complete, Arthur. The Cayman accounts are active, and the Charleston properties have been shifted to the holding company as discussed. By the time the sun hits the Cooper River, you'll be a ghost." I didn't reply. I looked out the window at the tarmac. In my mind, I could see the foyer of my home. I could see the small, unassuming mahogany box I'd left on the table. It was beautiful, really. An heirloom piece. Inside, there wasn't a check for Namtrum. Hong. Dola. Inside that box were the seeds of a total, scorched earth reality. I thought about Cassandra and Julian arriving at the house. I thought about the smug look on Julian's face as he'd reach for that box, thinking he'd finally broken the old man. I thought about the scream that would follow when they realized what was actually inside and what was now missing from their own lives. The pilot approached me, nodding respectfully. "Mr. Sterling, we're cleared for departure. Direct to San Jose, Costa Rica. Weather is clear all the way down." "Thank you, Captain," I said, standing up. My knees didn't ache as much as they usually did. The heavy weight in my chest had shifted, replaced by a cold, humming engine of anticipation. I had spent 30 years building an empire for a daughter who didn't exist. I had spent 5 years mourning a wife who would have been horrified by the woman our daughter had become. Tonight, the Sterling legacy didn't end. It just went into hiding. As the wheels of the Gulf Stream left the runway, I looked down at the flickering lights of Charleston. Somewhere down there, in a beach house I technically no longer owned, my daughter was dreaming of my money. She didn't know that the locks were already being changed. She didn't know that the credit cards in her purse were now pieces of useless plastic. And she certainly didn't know about the secret Elias and I had discovered 3 weeks ago, the one involving Julian, a high-stakes poker game in a basement on Broad Street, and a debt that Namtrum, Kongdola, wouldn't even begin to cover. The bind they were in was much worse than they'd told me. They were desperate, they were dangerous, and they thought I was their victim. I opened my folder and looked at a photo of Cassandra when she was 6, holding a seashell. I didn't feel sadness. I felt the grim satisfaction of a man who was about to teach his child the most important lesson of her life. I whispered to the empty cabin, "You wanted my assets, Cassie. Tomorrow, you're going to find out exactly what happens when the assets walk away." I closed my eyes as the plane leveled off at 30,000 feet. I didn't know it yet, but the box on the foyer table wasn't just the end of their financial lives. It was the opening of a door into a past Julian had tried very hard to bury a past that involved a name he thought I'd never hear. The hum of the Gulf Stream's engines was a low, vibrating roar that felt like it was trying to shake the very marrow of my bones. In the cabin's dim lighting, I watched the coastline of the Carolinas dissolve into a black void. It was a strange sensation, being a ghost before you're actually dead. For 65 years, Arthur Sterling had been a pillar, a name etched into the granite of Charleston's history. A man whose word was as good as gold, and whose bank account was even better. Now, I was just a passenger in seat high, heading toward a life where no one knew my name or the weight of the legacy I was carrying. To understand why I was fleeing my own home like a thief in the night, you have to understand the girl who kissed my cheek with ice in her heart. Cassandra wasn't born a monster. I had handcrafted her into one with every check I'd signed and every no I'd turned into a yes. When she was small, she was the light of the Sterling estate. I remember her running through the azaleas at our summer house in Beaufort, her yellow sundress fluttering like a butterfly's wings. She was Eleanor's pride and joy. My wife Eleanor was the moral compass of our family. She came from old Virginia money, the kind that doesn't shout, and she spent her life trying to teach Cassandra that wealth was a responsibility, not a weapon, but I was the one who spoiled the soil. Every time Eleanor tried to instill discipline, I was there with a velvet safety net. A crashed car at 16? I replaced it with a top-of-the-line SUV before the police report was even filed. A failed semester at Vanderbilt. I made a legacy contribution to the Dean's Building Fund. And suddenly, her grades were sterling again. I thought I was protecting her from the world. I didn't realize I was protecting the world from the person she was becoming. The real rot started when Julian Vance walked into our lives 6 years ago. He showed up at a charity gala for the South Carolina Historical Society, looking like he'd stepped off the cover of a luxury lifestyle magazine. He had this way of leaning in when he spoke, making you feel like you were the only person in the room while his eyes were busy scanning the perimeter for the most expensive thing in sight. Cassandra was smitten within 20 minutes. I saw the red flags early on, the way he dropped names of European aristocrats that didn't exist, the way his wealth seemed to be tied up in vague international venture capital that never quite materialized on a balance sheet. I tried to warn her. I remember a rainy afternoon on the veranda, the scent of damp jasmine heavy in the air, when I told her Julian's background check was thin. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just looked at me with a coldness that made the summer heat vanish. She told me I was jealous of his ambition because I had inherited my empire while he was building his from scratch. That was the day I realized I'd lost her. She didn't want a father. She wanted a financier for the fantasy life Julian was selling her. They married at the Cathedral of St. Luke and St. Paul. It was the wedding of the decade, 300 guests, a reception that cost more than most people make in a lifetime, and a cake that required its own climate-controlled tent. I paid for every penny of it. During the father-daughter dance, as the orchestra played some hauntingly beautiful waltz, Cassandra leaned in and whispered, "Now Julian can finally start his real work, Dad. He just needs a little seed capital to get the London office off the ground." That seed capital was $2 million. It vanished in 6 months. Julian blamed a market correction in the Eurozone. I wrote another check. Then came the boutique hotel project in Savannah. Then the cryptocurrency hedge fund that collapsed before the website was even finished. Every time they came to the study. Every time, Cassandra used the same tactic. A mix of daughterly affection and the subtle threat of withholding my grandchildren, little Leo and Mia, from my life. I hadn't seen my grandchildren in 3 months. Julian had decided that negative energy from the Sterling estate was affecting the kids' development. It was a ransom demand disguised as modern parenting. If I wanted to see the kids for Christmas, I needed to invest in Julian's new tech startup. But 3 weeks ago, something shifted. I wasn't just tired anymore. I was suspicious. I started doing my own digging, bypassing the usual agencies Julian was used to dodging. I hired a man named Silas, an ex-investigator from the Treasury who didn't care about social standing. What he found made my blood run cold. Julian wasn't just a bad businessman. He was a desperate one. He'd been frequenting a high-stakes, underground poker den in a basement on Broad Street, a place where the buy-in was $50,000, and the players were the kind of men who didn't use lawyers to collect their debts. Julian hadn't just lost his money, he'd lost mine. He had leveraged the deed to the beach house, which I'd foolishly put in Cassandra's name as a wedding gift, against a debt to a man named Cyrus Vane. Vane was a name whispered in the dark corners of the Lowcountry, a fixer for the wealthy who had a reputation for being as surgical as a shark. The num-trum, cum dola they demanded from me tonight? It wasn't for a tech startup. It was a life insurance policy. Julian had 48 hours to pay Vane, or Vane was going to start collecting in physical assets. As the plane crossed the Florida Keys, I looked down at the leather folder in my lap. Inside were copies of the documents I'd placed in that mahogany box in the foyer. I hadn't left them a check. I'd left them a mirror. I'd left the original deed to the beach house, not the one Julian thought he'd leveraged, but the actual deed. 2 years ago, I'd noticed Julian's predatory interest in that property and had quietly moved it back into a trust under my name, citing a tax restructuring that Cassandra had signed without reading. She was so used to signing whatever Daddy put in front of her that she never checked the fine print. I'd also left a series of photographs. Julian at the Broad Street basement, Julian handing over a briefcase to one of Vane's associates, and most importantly, a copy of the prenuptial agreement Julian had signed. He thought he'd been clever, having his own lawyer draft it, but Elias Thorne had slipped in a morality and financial transparency clause that nullified Julian's claim to any sterling assets if he was found to be engaging in illegal gambling or undisclosed debt. I had been holding that trigger for months, waiting for a sign that Cassandra might come back to me on her own. I kept hoping she'd see him for what he was. But tonight, when she invoked Eleanor's name to pay for Julian's sins, the hope died. You can't save someone who is using your heart as a stepping stone. The plane began its descent into the tropical darkness of Costa Rica. I looked at the time. It was Hong a.m. in Charleston. In 9 hours, they would walk into my house. They would find the foyer empty. No servants. I'd given them all a paid month-long vacation and a generous bonus to clear out by midnight. The great house would be silent, smelling only of floor wax and the ghost of Eleanor's perfume. Julian would be triumphant. He'd walk to that table, his chest puffed out, thinking he'd finally bled the old man dry. He'd open the box. He'd see the papers. He'd realize that not only was there no money, but the collateral he'd promised Cyrus Vane, the beach house, didn't belong to him. But there was one more thing in that box, something I hadn't even told Elias about. A small, digital recorder with a single button. On it was a recording from my study's hidden security system, one I'd installed after a burglary last year that I suspected Julian had staged. The recording wasn't of Julian. It was of Cassandra. 2 weeks ago, she had come to the house while I was out for a walk. She didn't know I was watching from the garden through the smart home app. She had gone into my bedroom, into Eleanor's jewelry box, and systematically replaced her mother's heirloom diamonds with high-quality fakes. She'd been selling her mother's soul to keep Julian's head above water for weeks. As the wheels touched the tarmac in San Jose, I felt a shudder go through me. It wasn't fear. It was the feeling of a clean break. I walked off the plane and was met by a driver holding a sign that simply said, S. We drove through the lush, humid night toward a villa perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific. I'd bought it 3 years ago under a shell company, a just-in-case plan I'd prayed I'd never need. I checked my burner phone one last time. A single notification from the house's security system. Foyer motion detected at Muimot, Namui Tarmam. They were early. I sat on the terrace of my new home, the sound of the ocean a rhythmic pounding in the distance. I could imagine Julian's face turning pale as he read the first page. I could imagine Cassandra's confusion turning into a frantic realization. But I hadn't just left them with nothing. I'd left them with an invitation. The last document in the box was a letter from Cyrus Vane's legal department. It seemed Julian hadn't just borrowed money. He'd promised Vane a seat on the board of Sterling Holdings, a seat he had no power to give. Julian had lied to a shark. And now, the shark was going to realize that the old man had left town with the only bait that mattered. My phone buzzed again. A frantic call from Cassandra. I didn't answer. I didn't block it either. I just watched the screen glow in the dark, a tiny, desperate light in the middle of a vast, silent jungle. Then came the text. Not from Cassandra, from a number I didn't recognize. He says he knows where you are, Arthur. Costa Rica isn't as big as you think. I froze. The ice from the Charleston study had followed me 5,000 miles south. I looked at the dark tree line surrounding the villa, the shadows suddenly looking a lot more like men. I realized then that Julian hadn't just been gambling with money. He'd been gambling with my location. The jungle didn't feel peaceful anymore. The rhythmic chirping of the cicadas, which had sounded like a lullaby an hour ago, now pulsed with a frantic, warning heat. I stared at the screen of the burner phone, the text glowing like a radioactive ember. Costa Rica isn't as big as you think. I looked at the glass of scotch on the side table. It was sweat-streaked, the ice long since melted. My first instinct was to call Elias, but I caught myself. If Julian had found me this quickly, it meant my digital footprint wasn't as erased as I'd thought, or worse, someone I trusted had a price. I stood up, my joints popping in the humid air, and walked to the edge of the terrace. Below, the Pacific was a churning expanse of obsidian, the waves crashing against the cliffs with a violence that mirrored the storm brewing in my chest. I began to realize that I had severely underestimated the depth of Julian's desperation. A man who gambles with a shark like Cyrus Vane doesn't just lose, he mutates. He becomes whatever the shark needs him to be to survive. I thought back to the first real warning sign, the one I'd buried under a mountain of fatherly denial. It was 2 years ago, during the annual Sterling Midsummer Gala at our estate in Beaufort. The heat had been oppressive, the kind of low-country humidity that makes the air feel like it's made of wet velvet. I had stepped into my private library to escape the noise of the string quartet when I heard voices from the balcony. "He's getting forgetful, Julian." Cassandra's voice had drifted in, sharp and clinical. "Did you see him at dinner? He couldn't remember the name of the ambassador's wife. It's starting." "It's perfect timing then," Julian had replied. His voice was smooth, devoid of the oily charm he used on me. It was the voice of a man conducting a cold inventory. "If we can get the physician to sign off on a cognitive assessment, we can move the primary holdings into the protective trust by the end of the quarter. He doesn't need to be burdened by the King Street permits anymore. I don't want him to suffer," Cassandra had said, but there was no warmth in it. It was the way one talks about putting down an old, expensive horse. I had stood in the shadows of my own library, surrounded by the leather-bound history of my family, and realized my daughter was already measuring me for a coffin. They weren't waiting for me to die. They were actively trying to accelerate my obsolescence. I should have cut them off then. I should have called Elias that night and burned the bridge. But I didn't. I told myself she was just stressed, that Julian was the one whispering poison in her ear. I wanted to believe that the little girl who used to catch fireflies in the marsh was still in there somewhere. What I didn't know then was that Julian had already begun preparing for my decline. A month after that gala, my vintage Chris Craft boat had suffered a catastrophic engine failure in the middle of the Cooper River. I was alone, miles from the marina, as the bilge began to fill with murky water. I'd managed to flag down a passing shrimp boat, but But when I took the engine to my mechanic, he'd found something chilling. The fuel line hadn't snapped. It had been notched with a serrated blade just enough to hold under low pressure, but destined to fail at cruising speed. I'd told myself it was a disgruntled former employee. I'd lied to myself because the alternative that my son-in-law was trying to drown me for a faster payout was a truth I wasn't ready to live with. The burner phone buzzed again, vibrating against the stone railing. Another text from the unknown number. She's crying, Arthur. She's looking for her daddy. But Julian? Julian is looking for a signature. He told Vane you have the power of attorney paperwork with you. Is that true? I felt a chill that the tropical heat couldn't touch. Julian was gaslighting the sharks. He was telling Cyrus Vane that I had fled with documents that could grant access to the Sterling Offshore Reserve's documents that didn't actually exist in the form he claimed. He was painting a target on my back to keep the crosshairs off his own. I walked back inside the villa, locking the heavy mahogany doors. The house was a fortress of glass and stone, but glass can be shattered. I went to the kitchen, where a small, nondescript floor tile under the pantry hid a secondary safe. My fingers hovered over the keypad. Inside wasn't money, it was my insurance. I pulled out a tablet and synced it to the hidden cameras I'd left active in the Charleston house. The feed was grainy but clear enough. The foyer was a scene of chaos. Julian was pacing the length of the marble hall, his face a mask of purple rage. He was holding the documents I'd left in the box. The real deed, the gambling photos, the morality clause. Cassandra was slumped in the wingback chair, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "He's gone, Julian. He's gone and he's ruined us," she shrieked, her voice echoing through the empty house. "The credit cards are dead. The bank flagged the house transfer. We're trespassing in our own home." "Shut up," Julian roared, slamming his fist into the foyer table. The mahogany box I'd left the one he'd opened with such greed clattered to the floor. "He hasn't ruined anything yet. He's an old man playing a game he doesn't understand. He thinks a few legal papers can stop what's coming." He grabbed Cassandra by the arm, hauling her up with a rough violence that made me surge toward the screen. "You're going to call him again. You're going to tell him you've had a medical emergency. You're going to tell him the kids are asking for him. You get him to pick up that phone, or, so help me, I will leave you here to explain to Cyrus Vane why his board seat just vanished into thin air." Cassandra looked at him, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of the old Cassie, the one who knew right from wrong. But then the fear took over, the same fear I'd cultivated by never letting her face a consequence. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling. I can't," she whispered. "He knows, Julian. Look at these photos. He's seen you at the basement. He's seen everything." Julian leaned into her, his voice dropping to a low, predatory hiss. "He's seen what I let him see, but he hasn't seen the end of this. I told Vane's people where the flight was headed. I told them he's got the master key to the trust. If I can't have the money, Arthur doesn't get to keep his life. It's a simple trade, Cassie. Your father's location for our debt." I felt the air leave my lungs. He hadn't just sold my location. He'd fabricated a reason for Vane to hunt me down. The master key was a myth Julian had invented, a supposed digital bypass for the sterling encryption that I supposedly carried on a thumb drive. It was a lie designed to make me a high-value target. In the villa, 5,000 miles away, I heard a twig snap in the jungle outside. It was a small sound, one that most people would have ignored in a forest full of life. But I hadn't spent 30 years surviving the cutthroat world of real estate by ignoring the small sounds. I moved to the wall, switching off the interior lights. The villa plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the moon reflecting off the ocean. I peered through the slats of the blinds. Down at the base of the driveway, a pair of headlights cut through the greenery, then went dark. A car had pulled up to the gate. My security system hadn't alerted me. That meant the gate had been opened with a code. There were only 3 people who had the gate code. Elias, Margaret, my late wife's sister who lived in Houston, and Cassandra. I had given Cassandra the code years ago when I first bought the property, back when I still dreamed of her bringing the grandchildren here for the summer. I'd forgotten to change it in the flurry of my departure. I watched 2 shadows emerge from the car. They weren't moving like tourists. They were moving with the synchronized efficiency of professional predators. They weren't carrying luggage, they were carrying gear. The burner phone buzzed in my hand. One new message. "They're at the gate, Arthur. I hope you're better at hide-and-seek than you were at being a father." The text didn't come from an unknown number this time. The caller ID read, Cassandra. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. My own daughter had given up the code. She hadn't just stood by while Julian sold me out. She had actively provided the key to my front door. I looked at the graduation photo on my tablet, the one she'd claimed to cherish. It was all a lie. The tears in the foyer, the fear it was just a performance for the cameras she knew I'd be watching. They weren't just coming for the money anymore. They were coming to erase the only person who stood between them and the sterling name. I didn't panic. Panic is for people who have something left to lose. I grabbed the leather folder, the tablet, and a heavy iron fire poker from the hearth. I knew this villa better than anyone. I knew about the crawl space behind the wine cellar, a remnant of the original builder's paranoia. As I slipped into the shadows of the hallway, I heard the electronic chirp of the front door's keypad. Beep, 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 beep. The lock turned with a heavy, metallic click. "Arthur?" A voice called out, a man's voice, gravelly and unfamiliar. "We know you're in here, Mr. Sterling. Let's make this easy. We just want the thumb drive, and we can all go home." I held my breath, pressed against the cold stone of the wine cellar wall. I realized then that the revenge I had planned, the little box in the foyer, the legal documents, was just the beginning. I had been playing checkers. Julian was playing for blood. But there was one thing Julian didn't know. He thought I was an old man who had spent his life behind a desk. He forgot that before I was a Sterling, I was a merchant seaman who had fought my way through the docks of North Charleston to build my first dealership. I wasn't hiding in the cellar to escape. I was hiding in the cellar because in the dark, the man who knows the house is the king. What happened next changed everything. Not because of the men in my house, but because of the third shadow I saw on the security feed just as I closed the cellar door, a shadow that didn't belong to Vane's men, and certainly didn't belong to Julian. It was someone I hadn't seen in 10 years. I pressed my back against the cold, sweating stone of the wine cellar, the smell of damp earth and aging oak filling my lungs. The tablet in my hand was the only source of light, its screen dimmed to a sliver of ghost blue. On the monitor, the two men, Rudy and Knox, Vane's collection agents, were moving through the great room with the casual indifference of wrecking balls. They were tossing my hand-carved mahogany furniture, ripping the velvet cushions I'd imported from Milan, and shattering the crystal decanters that had survived the Civil War. They were looking for a master key that didn't exist, a phantom Julian had conjured to save his own skin. But it was the third figure on the perimeter of the terrace that stopped my heart. Malcolm "Mac" Garrett. Mac, my old partner. The man who had helped me build the Sterling Empire from a single gravel lot in Somerville to a multi-state conglomerate. 10 years ago, Julian, then just a fresh-faced investment prodigy, had presented me with proof that Mac was skimming from the construction funds of our flagship luxury development. I'd been so blinded by Julian's apparent loyalty, so eager to trust my new son-in-law, that I'd cast Mac out. I'd ruined his reputation in the Charleston clubs, frozen his shares, and watched him disappear into the shadows of the Carolinas. Now, he was here, in the Costa Rican jungle, watching the men who were hunting me. "Arthur," Julian's voice suddenly boomed through the villa's integrated speaker system. He was calling from Charleston, patched in through the security interface he'd hacked using Cassandra's administrative credentials. "I know you can hear me. Don't be a martyr for a thumb drive, Arthur. Just tell Rudy where it is, and we can end this little vacation of yours with some dignity intact." I leaned my head against the stone wall, closing my eyes for a second. The humiliation was a physical weight, heavier than the fear. My house was being ransacked, my sanctuary violated, and my son-in-law was talking to me like I was a senile child who'd hidden a toy. "Cassie is right here, Arthur." Julian continued, his voice dripping with a poisonous, practiced empathy. "She's worried sick. Leo and Mia are asking why Grandpa ran away in the middle of the night. Do you want them to remember you as a fugitive? Or do you want to be the hero who saved their father's business? It's a simple choice." I looked at the tablet. In the Charleston foyer, I saw Cassandra. She wasn't sobbing anymore. She was sitting on the stairs of the house she thought she'd inherited, watching Julian pace with an expression I couldn't decipher. Was it guilt? Or was she just calculating the value of the silver Julian was already planning to hawk? "Daddy, please." Cassandra's voice came through the speaker, echoing in the empty, dark hallways of my villa. "Just give them what they want. Julian says everything can go back to normal if you just cooperate. We can be a family again. We can bring the kids down for Christmas. Don't make this harder than it has to be." The lie was so transparent it made my teeth ache. There was no normal to go back to. Julian had already burned the house down. He just wanted me to sign for the insurance. I remembered the early warning signs I'd willfully ignored during the takeover years. It had been a slow, methodical erosion. Julian had replaced my loyal staff with his own consultants. He'd moved the Sterling headquarters from its historic Broad Street office to a sterile, soulless glass box in Mount Pleasant. He'd systematically alienated me from my oldest friends, telling me they were too old-fashioned to understand the digital age. He'd spent 5 years humiliating me in my own boardroom, talking over me, correcting my dated references, making me but like a ghost in my own skin. He'd once told a room full of investors that I was the face of the past, while he was the engine of the future. I had sat there and taken it. For her. For my daughter. They're getting impatient, Arthur. Julian's voice sharpened, the charm finally peeling away to reveal the grit beneath. Rudy isn't known for his hospitality. If they find you before you come out voluntarily, I can't guarantee the outcome. Think about the legacy. Think about what Eleanor would say. On the screen, Knox had reached the wine cellar door. He kicked it, the heavy reinforced wood groaning on its hinges. I gripped the iron fire poker I'd snatched from the hearth upstairs. My knuckles were white, my hands surprisingly steady. I wasn't the merchant seaman I used to be, but I still knew how to find a point of vulnerability. I watched Knox pull a small crowbar from his tactical belt. He was going to pry the lock. But then, something happened on the terrace feed. Malcolm Garrett didn't stay in the shadows. He moved with a silent, predatory grace I hadn't seen in a decade. He stepped onto the terrace, a suppressed pistol in his hand. He wasn't there to help Rudy and Knox. He walked up behind the third man a lookout Vane had left by the pool and neutralized him with a single, professional strike to the base of the skull. I stared at the screen. Mac wasn't working for Julian. He wasn't working for Vane. What happened next changed everything. Knox shattered the cellar lock. The door swung open, splashing the stairs with light from the hallway. I retreated further into the crawlspace, my heart hammering against my ribs. Arthur, come out, wherever you are. Knox drawled, his boots heavy and rhythmic on the wooden steps. I reached for the tablet, my finger hovering over a specific command in the custom smart home app, one Julian didn't know I'd added during the villa's renovation. I had labeled it pest control in the code. Julian. I yelled, my voice finally cracking the silence of the villa. I knew the intercom would pick it up. You want the master key? It's in the safe in the floor of the study. But you forgot one thing about the Sterling name. What's that, Arthur? Julian's voice came back, smug and cold, thinking he'd won. We never leave the house without locking the door behind us. I tapped the pest control button. Steel shutters, designed for hurricane protection but reinforced with industrial-grade locks, slammed down over every window and door in the villa simultaneously. The sound was like a series of heavy gunshots echoing through the valley. The house was now an airtight, lightless tomb. Knox froze on the cellar stairs. Rudy shouted from the great room, his voice high and panicked. What the hell was that? Rudy, the doors are gone! Knox yelled, fumbling for his flashlight. I stepped out of the crawlspace, the fire poker held low and ready. That was the sound of Julian's debt coming due, I said, my voice vibrating with a cold, terrifying calm. But as the shutters sealed us in, I saw one final image on the tablet before the exterior cameras were cut off. Malcolm Garrett was standing at the front door, looking directly into the camera lens. He didn't look angry. He looked expectant. He held up a hand, and in it was a small, encrypted, drive the actual master key to the Sterling offshore reserves. I didn't know it yet, but Mac hadn't been skimming 10 years ago. He had been saving the Sterling assets from a predator he saw coming long before I did. He'd hidden the wealth in a substrata of accounts Julian couldn't touch, and the man I had thought was my enemy was the only one who could get me out of the tomb I'd just built for myself. Julian, I whispered into the intercom, knowing he was still listening in South Carolina. I hope you're watching. Because you didn't just sell me out to a shark. You sold me out to the man who knows exactly what happened to your first wife in London. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It was the most satisfying sound I'd heard in a decade. But then, the screaming started upstairs. Not from Rudy or Knox. It was a woman's voice. High-pitched, frantic, and coming from the kitchen. Someone else was already inside the house before I dropped the shutters. Someone who didn't need a gate code or a key. Someone who had been hiding in the pantry, waiting for the lights to go out. I realized with a jolt of pure horror that my trap had just locked me inside with the one person Julian feared more than Cyrus Vane. The scream didn't just pierce the silence of the villa. It seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the house. It was a jagged, desperate sound that cut through the low-frequency hum of the hurricane shutter's motors. Upstairs, in the pitch-black kitchen, someone was fighting. I heard the crash of heavy copper pots hitting the floor and the distinct, wet thud of a body being slammed against the marble island. "Rudy, help!" Knox yelled from the cellar stairs. He was fumbling with his flashlight, the beam dancing frantically across the stone walls like a panicked firefly. He wasn't looking for me anymore. He was looking for an exit that no longer existed. I stayed low, my fingers white-knuckled around the iron fire poker. I hadn't expected another guest. I'd designed this trap for 2, not 3. But as I watched the tablet's thermal feed, one of the few things still functioning in the dark, I saw a heat signature in the kitchen that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't the hulking mass of Rudy or the wiry frame of Knox. It was smaller, moving with a terrifying, calculated precision. "Julian," I whispered, leaning toward the intercom. I knew he was still there, 5,000 miles away, anchored to his desk by the sheer weight of his own greed. "You've gone very quiet. Is it the name? Does Siobhan's memory still have that much power over you?" For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound on the line was Julian's heavy, ragged breathing. It sounded like a man drowning in a shallow pool. Then, I heard a chair scrape back. "She's dead, Arthur." Julian finally spoke, his voice a ghost of the arrogant baritone from 10 minutes ago. It was thin, reedy, and laced with a terror that no amount of sterling money could soothe. "She died in London. A car accident. The police report. I have the police report. You have a piece of paper you paid £5,000 for." "Julian," I countered, moving silently toward the back service stairs of the cellar. "But Mac didn't go to the police. He went to the morgue. And he found a body that didn't match the dental records of the woman you claim to love. You see, Julian, when you try to erase a person, you have to make sure they don't have friends in low places." "Daddy, what are you talking about?" Cassandra's voice broke through the feed. I could hear the confusion, the beginning of a sickening realization. Who is Siobhan? Julian, who is he talking about? "Nobody, Cassie. He's senile. He's hallucinating." Julian roared, but the lie lacked its usual venom. It was the desperate flailing of a man who realized the ground had just vanished beneath his feet. Upstairs, the kitchen went silent. Then, the heavy metallic thud of a body hitting the floor. Rudy. The thermal feed showed his heat signature sprawled out near the pantry, cooling rapidly. He wasn't dead, but he was out. I reached the top of the service stairs and nudged the door open an inch. The air in the villa was thick with the scent of ozone and expensive floor wax. A single flashlight lay on the kitchen floor, its beam illuminating a pair of combat boots. A woman stepped into the light. She wasn't a ghost. She was a woman in her late 30s, her hair shorn short, her face a map of scars and cold determination. She was holding a taser in one hand and a serrated blade in the other. "Arthur," she said. Her voice was low, carrying a faint London accent that Julian must have spent years trying to forget. "You can come out. The help is indisposed." I stepped into the kitchen, the fire poker still raised. "Siobhan Vance, I presume. Or is it just Siobhan now?" She looked at me, her eyes hard as flint. "It's Siobhan Garrett. Mac is my brother, Arthur. The one you helped Julian destroy 10 years ago." The room tilted. "My old partner, Mac Garrett. I'd known him for 30 years, but I'd never known he had a sister. Julian had introduced us to his fiancée in London as an orphan with no living relatives. He'd isolated her, just like he'd tried to isolate me. He'd built a wall of lies so high that even the people inside couldn't see over it. "Julian," Siobhan said, looking directly at the security camera in the corner of the ceiling. "I know you're watching. I know you can see me. Do I look like a car accident to you?" On the intercom, I heard a sickening sound, the sound of Julian vomiting. The polished, Ivy League facade had finally, completely shattered. "Julian?" Cassandra's voice was a whisper now, small and hollow. "You told me you were never married before. You told me I was the only one. You told me your parents died in a fire." He tells everyone what they need to hear to keep the checks coming. "Cassandra," Siobhan said, her gaze shifting to the intercom. "He didn't marry you for love. He married you because the Sterling Trust was the only thing big enough to cover the debt he owed to the people I work for now." "You work for Vane?" I asked, a cold dread pooling in my stomach. Siobhan laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Vane is a middleman, Arthur. He's a shark, but even sharks have masters. I'm the one who sent the text about the master key. There is no thumb drive. There never was. Mac and I just needed a way to get you to drop the shutters and lock Julian's assets inside with us." "Wait," I said, the pieces clicking together in a way that made me feel like the fool I truly was. "You're not here to save me." "I'm here to collect," Siobhan said. She stepped toward me, the blade glinting in the flashlight's beam. Julian promised a seat on the Sterling board as collateral for a $10 million loan he took out in my name 3 years ago. He used my identity, the one he thought was buried, to funnel money through a shell company in the Caymans. When the money vanished, the debt defaulted to me, and the people I answer to don't accept clerical errors as an excuse. He didn't take 10 million, I stammered. He couldn't have. He did, Saban said, and he signed the board seat over to S. Garrett. He thought he was being clever, using a name he thought was dead. But Mac has the original documents, and now that you've locked the house, Arthur, you're going to help me execute the transfer of the King Street development to the Garrett estate. No, I said, backing away toward the great room. That development is the future of this family. It's for my grandchildren. Your grandchildren are the heirs to a legacy of theft, Siobhan snapped. Julian didn't just steal from me. He stole from Mac. He stole from you. And tonight, the bill is due. Arthur, don't listen to her, Julian's voice screamed through the speakers. She's a criminal. She's a liar. Rudy, get up. Get up and kill them both. But Rudy wasn't getting up, and Knox was still trapped in the cellar, screaming for mercy he hadn't earned. Suddenly, the intercom hissed with static. Arthur, can you hear me? It was Mac's voice. It wasn't coming through the house system. It was coming from my tablet, which had just re-established a connection to a private server. Mac, your sister is in my kitchen with a knife, I said, my voice shaking with rage. Is this why you're here? To finish what Julian started? I'm here to stop her, Arthur, Mac said. His voice sounded weary, older than I remembered. Siobhan, put the knife down. This isn't how we do this. We have the papers. We don't need blood. We need justice, Mac, Siobhan yelled at the ceiling. He left me for dead in a rain-slicked alley in Chelsea. He took everything. Our family name. Our dignity. I'm not leaving this house without the Sterling signature. Arthur, Mac's voice was urgent now. Listen to me very carefully. The shutters you dropped? They're not just steel. Julian had Knox rig them with a secondary charge. If anyone tries to force them open from the outside, or if the pressure in the house drops, they're designed to collapse the roof. He didn't want a vault, Arthur. He wanted a crematorium. He's going to kill all of you to hide the evidence of what he's done. I looked up at the ceiling. I saw the small, red blinking lights of the sensors I'd ignored during the installation. Julian hadn't helped me renovate this villa out of the goodness of his heart. He'd turned my sanctuary into a bomb. Julian? I whispered. If I can't have the Sterling name, Julian's voice was calm now, a terrifying, glassy kind of calm that signaled the end of his sanity. Then no one will. Goodbye, Cassie. I'm sorry you weren't smarter. I'm sorry your father was so stubborn. Julian? Julian, what are you doing? Cassandra's voice rose to a scream. Put the phone down. Julian. Then the line went dead. In the silence of the villa, I heard a new sound. It wasn't a body hitting the floor or a shutter closing. It was a faint, high-pitched electronic whine coming from the vents. A timer. Siobhan froze. She looked at the vents, then back at me. The hatred in her eyes was momentarily replaced by a cold, sharp fear. How long? She asked. I don't know, I said, my mind racing. But the pest control protocol was meant to be foolproof, if the shutters are rigged. We're in a steel box with a madman holding the remote, Siobhan finished. Down in the cellar, Knox began to wail. Above us, the tropical rain started to fall, drumming against the steel shutters with a sound like 1,000 tiny hammers. I looked at my tablet. Mac was gone from the terrace. The exterior feed showed a black SUV screaming up the driveway, but it wasn't Vane's men. It was a team of people in tactical gear, and they were carrying a breaching ram. No, I shouted at the screen, though they couldn't hear me. Don't touch the doors. It's rigged. But it was too late. I saw the lead man plant the charge on the front door. Siobhan, get down. I tackled her just as the world turned into a roar of white light and searing heat. The explosion didn't just blow the door. It triggered the secondary charges in the lintels. The ceiling of the kitchen began to groan, the heavy oak beams splintering like toothpicks. Dust and debris rained down, choking the air. As I lay on the floor, my ears ringing and my vision blurred, I felt a hand grab my collar. It wasn't Siobhan. It was Knox, who had managed to crawl out of the cellar in the chaos. He looked like a demon in the dust, his face bloodied, a jagged piece of glass in his hand. Where is it? He hissed, his breath hot against my ear. Where's the drive, old man? Tell me, or I'll carve it out of you before the roof comes down. I looked past him, toward the shattered remains of the front door. Through the smoke, I saw a figure walking toward us. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. He was wearing a bespoke suit, and he was holding a silenced pistol. It was Julian. He hadn't been in Charleston. The whole feed had been a loop, a masterfully crafted deception to make me think I was safe while he was already on the ground in Costa Rica. He looked down at me, his eyes empty of everything but the cold, hard vacuum of his ambition. "You always did talk too much, Arthur," he said, leveling the gun at my forehead. "Now, let's talk about that signature one last time." The dust from the explosion tasted like pulverized history, a mixture of old plaster, gunpowder, and the bitter tang of the sterling legacy coming apart at the seams. My ears were ringing with a high-pitched, metallic whine that made my skull feel like it was being split by a wedge. I looked up through the haze, my vision swimming in fractals of gray and orange. Knox was still looming over me, his face a mask of jagged, bloody desperation, but he had frozen. We both had, because the man standing in the wreckage of my front door shouldn't have been there. Julian Vance looked immaculate. Despite the humidity, despite the chaos, his charcoal gray suit was crisp, his silk tie perfectly knotted. He held the silenced pistol with the casual grace of a man holding a flute of champagne at a garden party. The flickering emergency lights of the villa cast long, dancing shadows across his face, making him look like something carved from cold marble. "The feed was a loop, Arthur," Julian said, his voice cutting through the ringing in my ears like a razor through silk. "I recorded that foyer drama 3 days ago. I knew you'd be watching. You always were a voyeur of your own family's misery. It kept you occupied while I caught a private charter out of Savannah." I tried to speak, but my throat was clogged with debris. I managed a raspy, broken sound. "Cassie." "Oh, Cassandra is still in Charleston," Julian said, checking his watch with a smirk. "Or at least, she's in the house. I imagine she's quite confused why the doors are locked from the outside and the Wi-Fi has been cut. She served her purpose, Arthur. She gave me the gate code, the security bypasses, and most importantly, she gave me the time to get here before Vane's men could finish the job. I couldn't have Rudy and Knox getting their hands on the master key before I did, could I?" Knox snarled, his grip on the glass shard tightening. "You set us up, Vance. You said the old man was a pushover. You didn't say the house was a goddamn bomb." Julian didn't even look at him. He just shifted his aim slightly and pulled the trigger. There was a soft foot, and Knox collapsed onto me, a neat red hole appearing in the center of his forehead. The weight of the dead man pinned me to the floor, his warm blood soaking into my shirt. I didn't scream. I didn't have the breath for it. I just stared at Julian, the man I had welcomed into my home, the man I had treated like the son I never had. "Now then," Julian said, stepping over Knox's body. He kicked the iron fire poker away from my reach. "Siobhan, dear, you can come out now. I know you're not dead. You're far too spiteful to die in a simple structural collapse." From behind the shattered remains of the kitchen island, Siobhan rose like a ghost from the shadows. She was bleeding from a cut on her hairline, her eyes burning with a cold, incandescent rage. She didn't have her knife anymore. It had been lost in the blast. "You're a dead man, Julian," she spat. "Mac is outside. Vane's people are coming. You can't kill everyone." "I don't have to kill everyone," Julian countered. "I just have to kill the right people. And I need Arthur to sign one very specific, very ironclad document before he joins his lovely Eleanor in the great beyond." He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a single sheet of vellum. It was a deed of transfer not for the King Street development, but for the entire Sterling Global Trust. Everything. The holdings in London, the real estate in New York, the offshore accounts in the Caymans. If I signed that, Julian wouldn't just be wealthy, he'd be untouchable. He'd have the liquidity to pay off Vane, Siobhan, and 10 other creditors, with enough left over to buy a new identity in a country that didn't have an extradition treaty. "I won't sign it," I croaked, my voice finally finding its strength. "You've already killed Knox. You've blown up my house. Just pull the trigger, Julian. End it." Julian knelt down beside me, the barrel of the gun cold against my temple. "See, that's the problem with you old money types. You think honor is a shield. It's not. It's a target. If you don't sign this, Arthur, I'm not going to kill you. Not yet. I'm going to call my associates back in Charleston. They're standing outside the beach house right now. The one where your grandchildren, Leo and Mia, are currently sleeping." The world stopped. The ringing in my ears vanished, replaced by a roar of blood so loud it felt like a physical storm. "They're with their mother," I whispered. "You wouldn't. Cassie is a liability," Julian said, his voice devoid of any human emotion. "She's weak. She's starting to feel guilty. And guilt is a disease that leads to confessions. If I don't get that signature, the beach house becomes a very beautiful, very expensive funeral pyre. Is that the legacy you want, Arthur? The man who saved his money but let his bloodline burn? I looked at Shiban. She was watching us, her face unreadable. She knew about the debt, she knew about the lies, but even she seemed staggered by the sheer, calculated cruelty in Julian's eyes. This wasn't just business anymore. This was a soul that had completely rotted away. You're a monster, I said. I'm an evolution, Julian corrected. Now, sign. Or the next sound you hear will be a phone call you'll regret for the rest of your very short life. He shoved a pen into my hand. My fingers were slick with Knox's blood. I looked at the document, the Sterling Global Trust, my life's work, my father's sweat, Eleanor's dignity. I looked at Julian. I saw the triumph in his eyes. He thought he'd reached the endgame. He thought he'd hit me at my lowest point, the rock bottom where a man will do anything to save what's left. And he was right. I was at rock bottom. But rock bottom is also a very solid place to stand when you're getting ready to push back. There's something you don't know, Julian, I said, my voice suddenly steady. Something Eleanor and I kept from everyone, even Cassandra. Julian sneered. What? Another hidden account? A secret vault? No, I said, a grim smile touching my lips. A liability. You see, the Sterling Global Trust isn't an asset. It hasn't been for years. My father, he was a brilliant man, but he was a gambler of a different sort. He leveraged the family name against a series of industrial loans in the 70s that never fully cleared. Eleanor and I spent 30 years just servicing the interest, keeping the facade alive so Cassandra could grow up with the Sterling prestige. Julian's brow furrowed. What are you talking about? I've seen the audits. I've seen the King Street projections. The audits were faked, Julian. I faked them, just like you faked your venture capital reports. I needed the King Street development to go through just to break even. If you sign that trust over to yourself, you aren't inheriting a fortune. You're inheriting a $300 million debt to the Federal Reserve. A debt that is currently under investigation for racketeering. The color began to drain from Julian's face. It was a slow, delicious descent into panic. You're lying. You're trying to stall. Why do you think I ran? I laughed, a harsh, racking sound that brought up a spray of blood. I didn't run from you, Julian. I ran from the SEC. I was going to let you and Cassandra have the assets so I could disappear with what little liquidity I had left in the Caymans. If you take that trust, you become the primary target for a federal RICO case. You'll be in a supermax prison before the month is out, and Vane will still be looking for his money. Julian's hand was shaking now. The gun wavered. He looked at the document, then back at me. You ruined the name? You let the Sterling name become a debt trap? I protected my daughter, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. I kept the debt in the trust so she would never have to pay for it. But if you take it, it's all yours, Julian. Every cent of the interest. Every year of the prison sentence. This was the hidden truth. The Sterling Empire was a hollow shell, a beautiful, gilded cage I'd been trapped in for decades. I had lived a lie to give my daughter a truth she didn't deserve. And now, I was offering that cage to the man who wanted to be its king. Siobhan took a step forward, a look of stunned realization on her face. Mac told me there were irregularities, but he never said it was that big. Arthur, you've been running a Ponzi scheme on your own life. To keep her safe, I said, looking Julian in the eye. Now, do you still want the signature? Or do you want to find out what Cyrus Vane does to a man who can't pay him and has the FBI breathing down his neck? Julian let out a low, guttural growl. He didn't sign. He didn't shoot. He did something I didn't expect. He turned the gun toward Siobhan. If I'm going down, he hissed, then I'm clearing the board. I'll kill you, I'll kill Arthur, and then I'll find that thumb drive Mac is carrying. The real one. The one with the Cayman's liquidity. That's the only money that's real, isn't it, Arthur? I closed my eyes. I had played my last card, and the monster had simply decided to flip the table. But then, the high-pitched electronic whine from the vents stopped. It was replaced by a low, rhythmic thumping. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't a timer. It was the sound of the secondary charges being disarmed. The tablet in my hand, which had been dark, suddenly flared to life with a bright green light. A message scrolled across the screen. SYSTM override. Mac Garrett. Villa secured. Hang on, Arthur. The heavy steel shutters at the back of the kitchen didn't explode. They slid open with a smooth, hydraulic hiss. The cool, Rain-scented night air rushed in, clearing the dust and the smell of death. Standing in the opening, framed by the tropical storm and the flashing blue lights of local police, was Mac Garrett. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood a woman I hadn't seen in years, a woman who looked exactly like Eleanor, but with eyes that had seen too much of the world. "Cassandra?" I whispered, my heart stopping. But it wasn't Cassandra. It was Margaret, Eleanor's sister, the one I'd sent to Houston to keep her away from Julian's influence. She wasn't a socialite anymore. She was wearing a headset and carrying a tablet of her own. "The debt isn't real, Julian," Margaret said, her voice echoing through the ruined kitchen. "Arthur didn't run a Ponzi scheme. He just created a digital ghost of one. He knew you were sniffing around the trust, so he built a debt trap in the system. If you had checked the secondary ledger, the one Mac's been guarding, you'd have seen the sterling assets are exactly where they've always been, hidden behind a wall of fake liabilities." Julian's jaw dropped. He looked at the gun in his hand, then at the police officers swarming the terrace. He realized then that he hadn't just been outplayed. He'd been lured into a cage of his own design. "Arthur didn't hit rock bottom," Mac said, stepping over the threshold. "He just led you there." Julian screamed a raw, animal sound of pure, unadulterated failure. He turned the gun back toward me, his finger tightening on the trigger. He was going to take me with him. But Siobhan was faster. She didn't have a knife, but she had the iron fire poker Julian had kicked away earlier. She lunged, the heavy metal bar catching Julian across the wrist with a sickening crack. The gun flew across the room, skittering into the shadows. As the police tackled Julian to the floor, pinning him into the dust of the house he'd tried to steal, I felt a strange sense of peace. My house was a ruin. My son-in-law was a murderer in handcuffs. My partner was a man I'd wrongly accused. I looked at Margaret. "Where is she? Where is Cassandra?" Margaret's face softened, but there was a hardness in her eyes that told me the worst was yet to come. "She's at the beach house, Arthur. But she didn't just give up the codes. There's something else you need to see. Something Julian didn't know about his perfect accomplice." She handed me her tablet. On the screen was a video from the beach house security system recorded an hour ago. I watched, my breath hitching, as my daughter, Cassandra, walked into the kitchen of the beach house. She wasn't crying, she wasn't scared. She was sitting at the table with Cyrus Vane, and she was handing him a folder. "Julian is a fool," Cassandra's voice came through the speakers, clear and cold. "He thinks he's the architect, but I'm the one who knows where the real money is. My father buried it in the King Street Foundation. Literally. 10 million in physical gold, hidden in the concrete pour. Julian is the distraction. I'm the payout." I felt the last piece of my heart shatter. My daughter hadn't been Julian's victim. She had been his competition. I looked at the ruined villa around me and realized that my revenge plan hadn't just begun. It was going to have to be much, much bigger. I wasn't just fighting for my life anymore. I was fighting to destroy the monster I had raised with my own two hands. The silence that followed the video of Cassandra and Cyrus Vane wasn't empty. It was heavy, like the air in a room before a ceiling collapses. I stood in the wreckage of my Costa Rican kitchen, the cooling thermal signatures of dead and dying men around me, and I felt a sensation I hadn't felt in 40 years. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't even anger. It was a cold, absolute hollow where my heart used to be. I had spent my life building a fortress of wealth to protect my daughter, only to find out she was the one trying to burn it down from the inside. "Arthur," Mac said, his voice coming from somewhere far away. He put a hand on my shoulder, but I didn't feel it. I was staring at the tablet, watching my daughter, my Cassie, sip a glass of expensive wine while she bartered my life for a phantom pile of gold. "We need to move. Julian's arrest will hit the wires soon. Once Vane realizes his leverage in Costa Rica is gone, he'll move on the beach house. If Cassandra thinks the money is in the King Street Foundation, she's going to bring in heavy machinery. She'll destroy the project before it even opens." I looked at Mac, and for a second, his face blurred with the memory of the young man I'd started out with on the docks. I'd been so wrong about him. I'd let a snake like Julian poison the well of a 30-year friendship, and I'd let my own pride keep me from seeing the truth. "Let her," I whispered. My voice sounded like dry leaves skittering across a grave. "What?" Sivan stepped forward, wiping blood from her brow. She looked at me like I'd finally lost my mind to the blast. "Arthur, that's $10 million she's talking about. My brother and I have spent 10 years living in the dirt because of the Vance family's lies. We aren't letting that gold go to a woman who just sold her father for a seat at Vane's table." I turned to her, the ghost of a smile touching my lips. Siobhan, you're a Garrett. You should know better than anyone how the Sterling family operates. We don't hide our assets in concrete. We hide them in plain sight. I looked at the tablet again. The King Street development was built on the site of the old Sterling foundry. My grandfather used to say that the foundation was the only thing you could trust in this world. I told Cassandra that story when she was 10. I told her that if the world ever went to hell, the gold was in the ground. I wanted her to feel secure. I wanted her to know she'd always be taken care of. I paused, a bitter laugh bubbling up in my chest. But I never told her it was literal gold. The gold I was talking about was the land value, the permits, the structural integrity of a legacy built on honest work. She took a metaphor and turned it into a heist. She's so blinded by Julian's greed that she's looking for bars of bullion in a basement. Mac's eyes widened as the realization hit him. So there's no gold. Oh, there's something in that foundation, I said, my voice hardening. But it isn't wealth. 3 years ago, when we poured the secondary footings for the King Street parking deck, I had a special compartment installed. I was already starting to doubt Julian. I was starting to see the cracks in Cassandra's loyalty. I put a titanium case in that concrete, Mac. Inside that case isn't gold. It's the complete, unredacted ledger of every illegal transaction Julian Vance ever made, along with the original signatures of every city official he bribed to get those King Street permits. I looked at the thermal feed of the beach house. Cassandra and Vane were laughing now. Vane looked like he'd just won the lottery. I didn't know it yet, I said to the empty room, but I had built a trap for my daughter years before she even knew she was my enemy. I just didn't think she'd be the one to trigger it. Margaret stepped toward me, her face pale. Arthur, if she opens that foundation and finds those papers instead of gold, Vane will kill her. He's not a man who handles disappointment well. He's already killed 3 people this month for less than $10 million. I know, I said, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to run to her rescue. I didn't feel the need to sign a check to make the problem go away. I felt a cold, surgical necessity. She chose her partner. Now she gets to deal with the closing costs. But as I said the words, a pang of something ancient and primal flickered in my gut. No matter what she'd done, she was Eleanor's daughter. She had Eleanor's eyes. I looked at Margaret, and I saw the same conflict mirrored there. We're going back to Charleston, I announced. Not as fugitives, not as ghosts. We're going back as the board of directors. Siobhan, you wanted justice for what Julian did to you in London. You'll get it, but you're going to have to play a role you've never played before. And what's that? Siobhan asked, her hand drifting to the iron poker she still held. The buyer, I said. Vane wants the Sterling assets. Cassandra wants the gold. We're going to give them both exactly what they want, but it's going to be wrapped in a RICO indictment. The next 24 hours were a blur of high-altitude adrenaline and digital warfare. While we were over the Atlantic on a private charter Mac had secured through his own shadow network, Margaret and I worked the phones. We weren't calling banks. We were calling the people Julian had stepped on to get to the top. The architects he hadn't paid, the subcontractors he'd bullied, and the former partners he'd erased. I watched the sun rise over the Atlantic, the light hitting the clouds in a way that reminded me of the mornings Eleanor and I used to spend on the veranda. I realized then that my life had been a series of open loops. I'd left so much unfinished because I was too afraid to see the truth. I'd enabled my daughter's rot because I was too cowardly to face the fact that I'd failed as a father. What happened next changed everything. I muttered to myself, staring out the window. Because the revenge I was planning wasn't just for Julian and Cassandra, it was for me. I had to kill the man who let this happen. We landed at a private airfield outside of Beaufort at High, Hong AM. The air was thick with the scent of pluff mud and salt, the smell of home, and the smell of a looming storm. Mac had a team waiting. Not tactical mercenaries, but forensic accountants, and 2 very quiet men from the State Law Enforcement Division, SLED, who had been itching to get a look at Julian Vance for years. Arthur, one of the SLED agents said, shaking my hand, we've got the beach house under surveillance. Vane has 3 cars on the perimeter. They've brought in a jackhammer and a diamond blade saw. They're heading to the King Street site in an hour. They're planning to do the extraction under the cover of the Ba, Kong AM shift change. I felt a surge of cold energy. Is my daughter with them? She's in the lead car, the agent replied. She looks focused, Arthur. She's the one giving the orders to the crew. The betrayal hit me again, fresh and sharp, like a physical blow. She wasn't just a bystander. She was the foreman of my destruction. We drove into the city in a convoy of blacked-out SUVs. Charleston at Ba. Combe AM was a city of ghosts. The gas lamps flickered on the cobblestone streets, and the mist rolling off the harbor clung to the iron gates of the mansions like a shroud. I looked at the King Street development as we approached the massive skeleton of steel and concrete that was supposed to be the crowning achievement of the Sterling name. It looked like a cage. We took up positions in the darkened shell of a boutique hotel across the street. I held a pair of high-powered binoculars, my hands steady as stone. I saw the silver Porsche Julian's car pull up to the construction gate. Cassandra stepped out. She was wearing a high-visibility vest over her designer clothes, a hard hat perched on her perfectly styled hair. She looked like a parody of a worker. Beside her was Cyrus Vane. He was a tall, skeletal man with eyes that seemed to absorb all the light around him. He was smoking a cigarette, watching the crew unload the heavy machinery with the bored indifference of a man who had seen it all before. "She's pointing to the primary footing," Mac whispered, looking over my shoulder. "Right where you said." "She remembers the story," I said, my heart twisting. "She's using her father's bedtime stories to find his grave." I watched as the diamond blade saw bit into the concrete. The sound was a deafening, high-pitched scream that echoed through the empty streets of the city. Sparks flew into the night air, lighting up Cassandra's face. She looked triumphant. She looked like she was finally getting what she deserved. "Wait for it," I said to the sled agents. "Don't move until they hit the titanium." Minute after minute ticked by. The tension in the darkened hotel room was so thick I could taste it. Siobhan was vibrating beside me, her eyes locked on Vane. She wanted to move, to end it, but I held up a hand. "Let her find it," I whispered. "I want her to see what she's been hunting." The sound of the saw suddenly changed. It hit something hard, something that didn't yield like concrete. The crew stopped. Vane stepped forward, casting a long shadow over the hole. Cassandra reached in, her hands covered in gray dust. She pulled out the titanium case. It was small, no bigger than a briefcase, but it held the weight of 3 lives. Vane grabbed it from her, his greed finally breaking through his mask of boredom. He used a crowbar to snap the lock. Cassandra leaned in, her eyes wide, probably already imagining the shimmer of gold bars, the weight of the bullion that would buy her a new life, far away from the boring legacy of the Sterling name. Vane threw the lid open. The light from the construction lamps hit the contents. Not gold, just paper. Hundreds of sheets of high-density vellum, covered in the tight, cramped handwriting of Julian Vance and the official stamps of the South Carolina Treasury. The silence that followed was more deafening than the saw had been. Vane looked at the papers. He picked one up, his brow furrowing as he read the names, the dates, the amounts. Then he looked at Cassandra. The look on his face wasn't anger. It was a cold, predatory realization. He realized he'd been played. He realized that the woman standing in front of him hadn't brought him a fortune. She'd brought him a death warrant. If he was found with those papers, he wouldn't just go to jail, he'd be the target of every corrupt official in the state who didn't want their names on those ledgers. "Where is the gold, Cassandra?" Vane's voice was a low, terrifying growl that carried across the street. I don't know." Cassandra stammered, her voice thin and wavering. "This is where he said. My father said the gold was in the ground. This has to be it." "Maybe it's under the papers?" She scrambled toward the hole, her hands frantically digging through the dust and debris. She was sobbing now, the reality of her situation finally crashing down on her. "It has to be here. Daddy wouldn't lie. He wouldn't." Vane grabbed her by the hair, yanking her up with a violence that made me surge toward the window. "Your father didn't lie, you stupid girl," Vane hissed. "He just knew exactly what kind of person you were. He didn't hide gold. He hid a bomb, and you just handed me the detonator." He pulled a gun from his waistband and pressed it against her temple. "Wait," I whispered, my finger hovering over the send button on my tablet. "Arthur, now!" Mac yelled. I hit the button. Every floodlight in the King Street development snapped on at once, bathing the site in a blinding, artificial noon. At the same time, the speakers I'd hidden in the scaffolding roared to life. It wasn't a siren. It wasn't a warning. It was the sound of my voice, recorded 10 years ago, reading a story to a 7-year-old Cassandra. "And the king told the princess," my voice echoed through the streets of Charleston. "The greatest treasure isn't what you take from the earth, Cassie. It's what you leave behind for the people who come after you." Vane froze, squinting into the glare. Cassandra looked up, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror as she heard her father's voice coming from the walls of the building she was trying to destroy. Now! I roared. The sled teams moved with a precision that was beautiful to behold. They didn't come from the street, they came from the shadows of the building itself, dropping from the scaffolding like spiders. "Drop the weapon!" the lead agent screamed. Vane didn't drop it. He panicked. He turned toward the noise, his finger tightening on the trigger. But I didn't know it yet. But the final twist of the night wasn't going to come from the police or from my daughter. It was going to come from the man I'd thought was long gone. A single shot rang out from the darkness of the hotel room beside me. Vane's gun flew from his hand, his wrist shattered by a bullet he never saw coming. He collapsed into the dust, howling in pain. I turned around, my heart pounding. Standing in the doorway of the hotel room, holding a long-range rifle with a suppressor, was Julian Vance. He wasn't in handcuffs. He wasn't in jail. He looked at me with a wild, desperate grin, his clothes tattered, his eyes bloodshot. "You didn't think a little Costa Rican jail could hold me, did you, Arthur?" Julian laughed, a high-pitched, broken sound. "I had a contingency for the contingency, but I'm not here for the gold anymore. I'm here for the only thing that's left." He shifted his aim toward the construction site. He wasn't looking at Vane. He wasn't looking at the papers. He was aiming at Cassandra. "If I don't get the Sterling name," Julian whispered, "then no one gets to keep the bloodline." I didn't think. I didn't plan. I threw myself at him, my 65-year-old body moving with a speed I didn't know I still possessed. As we tumbled to the floor, the rifle went off. The sound of the shot was followed by a scream that will haunt me until the day I die. But it wasn't Cassandra's scream. I looked at the tablet one last time before it shattered in the scuffle. In the hole in the foundation, standing in front of Cassandra, was Siobhan Garrett. She had jumped from the second floor of the hotel while I was watching the drama unfold. She had taken the bullet meant for my daughter, and as she lay in the dust of the King Street project, she looked up at Cassandra and said the words that would finally, mercifully, end the lie. He never loved you, Cassandra. He just wanted to see if you were as hollow as he was." I pinned Julian to the floor, my hands around his throat, the iron fire poker finally finding its mark. But as I looked out the window at the chaos below, I realized that the revenge I'd sought was a hollow victory. My daughter was alive, but she was broken. My enemy was captured, but the cost was a woman's life. And the Sterling name? It was etched into a foundation that was now a crime scene. "Is it over?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. I looked at the sunrise breaking over the Cooper River, the light finally touching the top of the King Street steel. "No," I said, my voice cold and clear. "It's just the beginning of the audit." The weight of Julian Vance under my hands felt like pressing down on a bag of dry bones and shattered glass. He wasn't a titan of industry. He was a hollowed-out parasite whose host had finally turned toxic. As the sled agent swarmed into the hotel room, pulling me off him and slamming his face into the dusty carpet, I didn't feel the rush of victory I'd expected. I felt nothing but a cold, clinical exhaustion. "He's got a pulse," someone shouted from the construction site below. "Get the paramedics to the pit. We have a female down." I shoved past the officers, ignoring the sting of the debris in my eyes and the ache in my chest. I ran. I ran across the street, through the skeletal gate of the King Street project, and into the harsh, white glare of the floodlights. I didn't look at Cyrus Vane, who was being dragged toward a police cruiser, his wrist a bloody ruin. I didn't look at the titanium case of documents that had started this final war. I looked at the hole in the foundation. Siobhan Garrett lay on the gray concrete, her breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. Mac was already there, his hands pressed hard against her shoulder, his face a mask of primal agony. Beside them stood Cassandra. She was on her knees, her designer clothes stained with grease and grit, her hands hovering in the air as if she'd forgotten how to use them. She was staring at Siobhan, the woman who had just taken a bullet for her, with a look of pure, unadulterated shattering. "Mac," I breathed, dropping to the ground beside them. "She's hit bad, Arthur." Mac gritted out, his voice thick. "The bastard aimed for the heart. She moved just enough." Siobhan's eyes flickered open, catching the light. She looked at me, then at Cassandra. A small, bloody smile touched her lips. "Justice," she whispered, "is expensive." "Might." "Don't you dare," Mac growled. "You haven't spent the money yet, Siobhan. You haven't seen the look on Julian's face when they locked the door." The paramedics arrived then, a whirlwind of blue uniforms and orange bags. They lifted Siobhan onto a gurney, and for a moment, the site was filled with the frantic energy of saving a life. Mac went with her, leaving me alone in the dust with my daughter. Cassandra didn't look at me. She was staring into the hole in the foundation, the hole where she thought her fortune was buried. "There is no gold, is there?" she asked. Her voice was flat, the sound of someone whose soul had been surgically removed. No, Cassie, I said, standing up slowly. I felt every one of my 65 years. There was never any gold. I told you that story because I wanted you to value what we built. I wanted you to think of the foundation as something sacred. You turned it into a grave. She finally looked at me. Her eyes were hollow. The bright, ambitious girl I'd raised replaced by a stranger who looked like she'd been aging in a cellar for a century. Julian said, he said you were the one who was empty. He said you were holding on to the past because you didn't have the courage to face the future. Julian is a man who thinks the future is just a bigger score, I said. He didn't love you, Cassie. He didn't even see you. He saw a key to a vault, and the tragedy is, you handed it to him. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box, the one thing I'd taken from the Costa Rican villa that wasn't a document or a weapon. I opened it. Inside was the real wedding ring of Eleanor Sterling, the one Cassandra had replaced with a fake 3 weeks ago to fund Julian's debts. I'd found it in Julian's private safe in Costa Rica before I dropped the shutters. He didn't even sell it, Cassie, I said, holding the ring out. The diamond caught the floodlights, casting tiny, dancing stars against the concrete. He kept it, not as a memory of your mother, but as a trophy. He told his creditors it was his insurance policy, in case you ever got smart enough to leave him. He was going to use your mother's ring to pay for your replacement. Cassandra let out a low, keening sound, a sob that seemed to tear its way out of her throat. She collapsed back into the dust, her head in her hands. I'm sorry, Daddy, I'm so sorry. I looked down at her. 6 months ago, I would have reached out. I would have pulled her up, brushed the dust off her jacket, and told her we'd fix it. I'd have written the check. I'd have called the lawyers. But I didn't. I put the ring back in the box and tucked it into my pocket. Sorry is a word for people who break a vase, Cassie. You didn't break a vase. You tried to erase your father. You tried to sell your children's legacy to a shark. Where are they? She gasped, looking up with sudden, frantic terror. Leo and Mia? Vane said he had people at the beach house. The people at the beach house were mine, I said. Margaret is with them now. They're safe. But they aren't going back to you, Cassie. Not for a long time. You can't do that, she whispered. They're my children. And I was your father, I countered. Family is a privilege, not a right. You forfeited that privilege when you sat at a table with Cyrus Vane and discussed the depth of my foundation. I turned and walked away. I didn't look back when she called my name. I didn't look back when the police led her toward a separate cruiser for questioning. I walked out of the King Street project and toward the harbor, where the first light of dawn was turning the water from black to a deep, bruised purple. What happened next changed everything, not because of a twist of fate, but because of a choice. 3 months later, the dust had finally settled on the Sterling scandal. Julian Vance was in a federal holding cell, facing 40 counts of racketeering, fraud, and attempted murder. Siobhan's testimony from her hospital bed had been the final nail in his coffin. She had survived, though she walked with a cane, now a permanent reminder of the price of Julian's ambition. Mac and Siobhan had taken their share of the Sterling settlement and moved to the Greek Isles. Mac sent me a postcard every 2 weeks. The last one said, "The water is blue, the wine is cheap, and I don't miss the lowcountry one bit. Come visit, Arthur. Bring the kids." Cassandra was living in a small, 2-bedroom apartment in North Charleston. I hadn't given her a dime of the Sterling Trust. I had followed through on my word. She was working as a junior clerk in a law firm, the only place that would hire her after the headlines faded. She spent her weekends in supervised visits with Leo and Mia, who were living with Margaret in a quiet cottage in Somerville. I had liquidated the King Street development. I sold it to a nonprofit that turned the skeleton of the building into a center for displaced families and vocational training. The Sterling name was removed from the cornerstone. It wasn't about the name anymore. It was about the utility. I was back in Costa Rica. I sat on the same terrace where the nightmare had begun, watching the Pacific waves roll in. But I wasn't alone. "Grandpa, look." Leo ran across the stone tiles, holding a bright blue crab he'd found in the tide pools. Behind him, Mia was laughing, her hair a wild tangle of blonde curls that looked just like Eleanor's. Margaret was sitting in the lounge chair beside me, sipping a coffee. "They like it here," Margaret said softly. "It's a good place to grow up," I replied. "No foundations to dig through, just sand." My phone buzzed on the table. It was an email from the law firm where Cassandra worked. It was a scanned image of her first paycheck, a modest, hard-earned sum. Attached was a note. "Dad, I paid my rent this month. On time. I bought Leo a book for his birthday with my own money. I'm starting to understand what you meant about the gold. It wasn't in the ground. It was in the hands that build. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know I'm working on the foundation. Love, Cassie. I didn't reply. Not yet. But I didn't delete it either. I looked out at the ocean, the sun warming my face. I had lost my house, my company, and for a while, my soul. I had taken a brutal, scorched earth revenge on the people who tried to destroy me. But the real victory wasn't seeing Julian in a jumpsuit or Vane in a hospital bed. The real victory was the silence, the absence of demands, the end of the family bank. I picked up a seashell Leo had dropped and turned it over in my hand. It was perfect, fragile, and absolutely free. I realized then that the sterling legacy hadn't ended in that hole on King Street. It had just been redefined. Wealth isn't what you leave in a vault. It's the peace you feel when you no longer have to sleep with one eye on the door. I looked at my grandchildren, playing in the sun, and for the first time in 5 years, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt like a man who had finally come home, even if home was 5,000 miles from where I started. Justice had been served, the debts were paid, and the ledger was finally, mercifully, closed.